Imagine paying $20,000 for a Rolex and being told no one wants to touch it. Authorized dealers with empty display cases, independent watchmakers refusing modern Rolex repairs, and service wait times stretching into months, sometimes longer than a year. People are calling it a collapse. Others say it's fear-mongering. But when mechanics start walking away from the world's most valuable watches, something deeper is happening. The pattern nobody mentions. Greg Petronzi gets these calls constantly. Someone's grandmother left them a Rolex from 1973. Submariner, beautiful condition, sentimental value beyond calculation. They take it to the nearest authorized service center, expecting restoration. Maybe they're thinking about the marketing, the heritage, the craftsmanship, the promise. They sure weren't told about the denial. Sometimes they're told the crystal is too faded. Other times the dial shows too much aging. Occasionally, the movement needs parts that aren't available. The rejection comes wrapped in professional courtesy, but the message is consistent. We can't help you. If you bring a vintage piece to a Rolex service center, it's not uncommon to be turned away, Petronzi explains. He is one of the last independent watchmakers in America who specializes in vintage Rolex repair. Collectors call him the go-to guy for pieces Rolex won't touch. And business has never been better. Not because he's good at marketing, but because Rolex keeps turning customers away. The irony? Petronzi is also a licensed psychologist and professor at NYU. He studied for 12 years to become a psychologist. Watchmaking started as a hobby, turned into a side hustle, and eventually became his primary income. He took an introductory watchmaking course at the Horological Society of New York in 2016. Started tinkering with his own watches. Made friends with a veteran watchmaker named Rick Deedle who became an informal mentor. Built his skills through YouTube videos, practice movements, and obsessive attention to detail. By 2018, he took his first paying client. By 2025, he was earning more from watch repair than psychology. Draw your own conclusions about what that says regarding demand for services Rolex won't provide. But Rolex should provide those services. Their policies guarantee service for 35 years after a model is discontinued. After that, discretion of the service center. The Submariner 5513 discontinued in the late 80s. The GMT Master 1675 gone around 1980. The Explorer 1016 produced until approximately 1989. 4-digit date-just references from the 70s and earlier. These aren't obscure prototype failures or limited edition experiments. These are the watches that built Rolex's reputation as the brand that lasts forever. But here's what doesn't make sense. If this is just about old watches and discontinued parts, why are collectors reporting similar issues with watches from the 90s? Why did one watchmaker recently invest $15,000 in a single tool just to perform repairs Rolex service centers used to handle routinely? And why would Rolex build a billion-dollar production facility while simultaneously narrowing who can service their watches? The skills shortage that isn't. The obvious explanation? There aren't enough watchmakers. And the numbers seem to support this. In 1973, the United States had 32,000 watchmakers. Real watchmakers, trained in the traditional sense, capable of handling everything from pocket watches to complicated wristwatches. By 2000, that number collapsed to 6,500, an 80% decline in less than 30 years. The quartz crisis killed demand. Traditional watchmaking looked like a dying trade. Why learn to repair mechanical watches when everyone's wearing digital? Today, approximately 2,000 certified watchmakers remain in the entire country. Lidditz Watch Technicum in Pennsylvania, the crown jewel of American watch education, was founded by Rolex itself in 2001, specifically to address this shortage. It graduated its final class in July 2025. Not because it failed, but because Rolex decided to close it. Rolex identified a critical watchmaker shortage in 2001, built a state-of-the-art facility to fix it, spent $200,000 annually funding free tuition for students, designed the building with Michael Graves, the same architect who designed products for Target and illuminated scaffolding for the Washington Monument. Rolex created what students called a little slice of Switzerland, with imported Swiss pearwood paneling, a 40-foot timber frame made from Douglas fir, immaculate grounds with waterfalls and ponds. The program was rigorous. 3,000 hours over 2 years. Students paid only for their tools. About $6,500 for the school kit, though many bought more. The curriculum focused heavily on micromechanics, the ability to manufacture parts from raw materials, cut gears, create pinions, fabricate components when original parts don't exist. 25 years. 148 graduates with an 85% completion rate. Then suddenly, permanently closed. But wait, Rolex didn't abandon watchmaking education. They moved it. The Dallas Rolex Watchmaking Training Center opened in 2023. 24 students enrolled in September 2024. Another 27 began studies in early 2025. The facility is larger than Lidditz, more modern and handles all U.S. Rolex training programs that previously split between Lidditz and Seattle, and the program is now 18 months instead of 2 years. Shorter, faster, streamlined for efficiency. Wait, if the shortage is so severe, why shorten the training? If there's a genuine crisis in skilled labor, why reduce a 2-year intensive program focused on traditional craftsmanship to an 18-month certification focused on service efficiency? If there aren't enough watchmakers, shouldn't you want a more comprehensive education, not less? That's not all. The curriculum changed too. The Dallas program trains Rolex-certified watchmakers specifically for after-sales service on oyster movements, modern Rolex calibers. Students learn to disassemble, clean, oil, and reassemble current movements. They learn efficient service protocols. They become competent service technicians. What they don't learn, or learn to a much lesser degree, is micromechanics, the art of manufacturing replacement parts, the ability to fabricate a gear from raw stock, the skill to recreate components that no longer exist in Rolex's parts inventory. One industry professional compared micromechanics to calculus. Some students really enjoy micromechanics, but others don't because they feel they're never going to use it. Think about that. They're never going to use it. That's not a statement about individual student preferences. That's a statement about what Rolex expects their certified watchmakers to do, and apparently, manufacturing parts isn't on that list. Meanwhile, the building in Lidditz still operates as a service center. The space that trained generations of watchmakers converted to additional service bays, more capacity for repairs, just not for training people with the skills to handle the complicated ones. Let's add more contradictory evidence. In mid-2023, Rolex announced plans for 3 temporary production facilities in Switzerland, with the first operational in 2024. They're spending $1.1 billion on a massive new facility in Bull, expected to open in 2029. Production is increasing, not decreasing. Meanwhile, wait times for Rolex watches have actually improved. According to data aggregated from thousands of buyer reports on Reddit, the Submariner's median wait time peaked at 105 days in 2023. By 2024, down to 60 days. The GMT Master 2 dropped from 180 days to 90 days. The Explorer saw a 66% reduction in wait times. Production is expanding, training centers consolidating and accelerating. Wait times are declining. So where's the crisis? Walk into a Rolex Authorized dealer today, and you'll see what looks like proof of scarcity. Display cases with 2 watches, maybe 3, sometimes none. The Pepsi GMT case sits empty. The Submariner case, vacant. Maybe there's a date just in steel with a Jubilee bracelet, or a 2-tone model nobody seems excited about. The store looks ransacked, like a closing out sale happened yesterday and nobody bothered restocking. It's a theater. Carefully orchestrated theater. Rolex produces over 1 million watches annually. The company doesn't disclose exact figures. Swiss watchmakers guard production numbers, like state secrets, but industry estimates consistently land around 1 million units. That's not a boutique operation, cranking out 5,000 pieces a year. That's mass production by any definition that matters. So where are they? The allocation system. This is where things get tricky. Rolex doesn't operate a global waitlist. They don't publish queue positions. There's no number you can call to check your place in line. Instead, authorized dealers receive shipments, unpredictable in timing, uncertain in quantity, random in model mix, and decide internally who gets what. You walk into a dealer wanting a Submariner. The sales associate is polite, takes your information, explains that the watch is currently unavailable, but they'd be happy to register your interest. No promises, no time frames, just interest. Meanwhile, someone else walks in. Maybe they've bought 3 watches here before. Maybe they purchased $40,000 worth of jewelry for their spouse last year. Maybe they're a regular who buys a new watch every 18 months. That person? They might walk out with a Submariner that afternoon. You were told none exist, but one apparently materialized when the right customer appeared. This isn't speculation. Dealers openly acknowledge they prioritize customers based on purchase history, relationship with the store, and likelihood of keeping the watch rather than flipping it to gray market dealers. In practice, this creates a multi-tier system completely invisible to new buyers. Walk-in customers with no history see empty cases. They're told about waitlists, encouraged to buy other items to build a relationship, given vague timelines like maybe next year. VIP clients who've established themselves see watches. Not because more watches arrived, because those watches were always there, just not for everyone. Some regions have refined this to an art form. Authorized dealers in major cities reportedly hold inventory in back rooms rather than displaying it openly. The justification? Protecting watches from theft. Managing expectations. Maintaining the brand's exclusive image. But the practical effect is control. Sales associates decide which customers deserve to see what's actually available. First-time buyer in Manhattan wanting a steel Daytona? You're looking at potentially years. Could be 3, could be 5. Nobody knows. Established client in the same store who bought a day-date last year and regularly purchases jewelry? Maybe 6 months. Maybe they will call you when one arrives tomorrow. Same city, same store, same watch. Completely different experiences based on one factor: how much you've already spent there. And here's where it gets interesting. Wait times for retail purchases actually improved substantially from 2023 to 2024. Watch Chart's data aggregated from thousands of buyer reports shows the Submariner's median wait time peaked at 105 days in 2023. By 2024, down to 60 days. The GMT Master 2, which hit 180 days in 2022, dropped to around 90 days by 2024. The Explorer saw wait times fall by nearly 66% over 2 years. If watches are genuinely scarce, why are they becoming easier to get? The system behind the scarcity. Rolex released an official statement denying artificial scarcity. They said their watches are only available through official Rolex retailers who independently manage the allocation of watches to customers. They said they do not distribute watches directly to customers and do not keep waiting lists. Rolex even said availability depends on the level of demand and the retailer's inventory. Do you believe any of that? Rolex doesn't control wait lists because there are no official wait lists. True. But Rolex absolutely controls which dealers receive which watches, in what quantities, when, and with what guidance on allocation priorities. Dealers manage allocation, but they're managing inventory Rolex gave them based on criteria Rolex established. The Certified Pre-Owned program reveals the strategy. Previously, Rolex had no control over the secondary market. Someone bought a Submariner, wore it for 6 months, flipped it to a gray market dealer for a premium. That watch then circulated outside Rolex's ecosystem. Price determined by market demand, not Rolex policy. Buyer experience determined by gray market standards, not Rolex service protocols. Rolex's response: build a CPO program. Buy back watches. Certify them. Service them to Rolex standards. Sell them through official channels at prices Rolex determines. Now they participate in the secondary market as both buyer and seller. This creates fascinating incentives throughout the distribution chain. Authorized dealers now have reason to vet buyers more carefully. If they sell to known flippers, those watches immediately compete with their own inventory and undermine their allocation relationship with Rolex. Better to sell to customers who will keep the watch, wear it, eventually trade it back into the CPO program where Rolex profits again. Buyers who want immediate access face a choice: wait indefinitely in the allocation system or pay premiums on the secondary market where Rolex now operates. Either way, Rolex wins. Patient buyers eventually get watches through official channels at retail. Impatient buyers pay premiums on CPO or gray market, generating profits for Rolex or its dealers. The only losers are traditional gray market dealers and buyers who refuse to play either game. And the data suggests plenty of people are choosing option 3, just don't buy a Rolex. Gray market volume reportedly declined 20 to 30% from 2022 peaks. Some of that reflects price corrections, as secondary prices fell closer to retail. But some reflect what one analyst called the great opting out. Buyers deciding the experience of trying to buy a Rolex isn't worth the hassle regardless of price. At every point, the system funnels towards centralized control. Rolex controls production. Rolex controls distribution through authorized dealers operating under Rolex guidelines. Rolex controls allocation priorities through dealer incentives. Rolex controls service through certification requirements and parts restrictions. Rolex now controls significant portions of the secondary market through CPO. And it's working. Secondary market prices for many models fell substantially from 2022 peaks, but they're stabilizing closer to retail instead of continuing to collapse. Gray market volume declined, but authorized dealer sales remained strong. Service centers expanded capacity. Training consolidated into more efficient programs. From Rolex's perspective, this is exactly how it should work. They're organizing an ecosystem where every touchpoint, purchase, service, resale flows through channels they control, monitor, or participate in. The problem is that control and accessibility are inversely related. The more Rolex tightens control, the harder it becomes to simply buy a watch or service an old one. And somewhere in that trade-off, the promise of a watch that lasts forever, handed down through generations, starts feeling more theoretical than practical. When your forever watch expires. Michael Woods worked as a head watchmaker for Rolex for years before going independent in 2017. He explains the service center dilemma with the kind of clarity that comes from seeing it from both sides. If Rolex can't guarantee they can restore the watch to their standards functional, reliable, safe, they may not accept it. So, can't Rolex guarantee their own standards? You mean when a 70s Submariner comes in for service, it might not be fixed? This policy protects Rolex, though. This is what I mean. Let's say a 70s watch has a beautiful patina that warm, aged look collectors pay premiums for. The hands have developed a creamy lume that glows under UV light, confirming its tritium aging. The movement runs but needs attention. Standard service stuff for a 50-year-old mechanical watch. The service center evaluates it. The movement needs parts that Rolex no longer manufactures for that caliber. They could source them from donor movements, but that requires finding donor movements. They could fabricate replacements, but that's time-intensive, expensive, and requires watchmakers with skills beyond the standard service protocol. If Rolex services this watch to their current standards, they'll replace all of those components. New dial, new hands, new crystal. Basically, a complete restoration that erases everything collectors value about vintage pieces. See how it can be difficult for Rolex without that policy? But here's the catch. Rolex won't return your original parts. That's policy. When they replace your dial, that dial belongs to Rolex now. They keep it. Supposedly to prevent people from building Frankenwatches, assembling new watches from a mix of vintage and aftermarket parts. The logic makes sense from an anti-counterfeiting perspective. But in practice, it means your family heirloom gets stripped of everything that made it meaningful. The results might not be worth it for both parties, and this is why Rolex declines to fix the watch. And this is where independents like Woods and Petronzi enter. They'll service your watch. They'll replace what needs replacing but try to preserve what doesn't. They'll let you keep original parts even if they're replaced. They'll work within your goals as a collector rather than corporate service protocols. But there's a problem. Parts availability. Rolex restricts official parts sales to approximately 50 authorized independent watchmakers in the entire United States. That's 50 people out of thousands of watchmakers nationwide. Everyone else has to source parts through gray markets, donor movements, or fabrication. The secondary market for Rolex parts has become genuinely bizarre. Parts that authorized watchmakers could purchase directly from Rolex for $20 to $30 a few years ago now sell for $200 to $300 on eBay, when they appear at all. And because Rolex no longer manufactures parts for calibers discontinued over 35 years ago, that supply will never be replenished. What exists is what exists. When it's gone, it's gone. Petronzi recently invested $15,000 in a single tool he needs to perform one specific repair on vintage movements. Think about that. $15,000 for a tool to do a job Rolex service centers used to handle as routine maintenance. Some vintage Rolex repairs now cost more than the watch's market value. You have a 70s Datejust worth $4,000. Proper service from a competent independent might run $2,000 to $3,000 depending on what's needed. If parts need fabricating or sourcing from donor movements, you could hit $3,500 to $4,500. At that point, you're paying more to fix it than it's worth. Collectors make jokes, dark jokes, about donor watches, buying a second vintage Rolex specifically to harvest parts for the first one. That's not hyperbole or exaggeration. That's a legitimate strategy in 2026 if you want to maintain a vintage watch long-term. Compare this to Patek Philippe. The Geneva manufacturer will service any watch they've produced since 1839. If parts no longer exist in their inventory, they'll recreate them in their restoration atelier. The service takes time. It costs serious money. But the commitment is absolute and publicly stated. If Patek Philippe made it, Patek Philippe will fix it. No 35-year cutoff. No discretion. No denials. Rolex has to work on their policy. If Patek can do it, so can they. But what's stopping Rolex? What this actually means? Let's be precise about what's happening. Rolex isn't abandoning watchmaking. They're investing billions in new facilities, training more watchmakers through consolidated programs. Expanding service center capacity. The Dallas Training Center graduates more students annually than Lidditz did. The new Bull facility will increase production capacity substantially when it opens in 2029. But they're also narrowing the definition of what Rolex service encompasses. Faster training produces watchmakers capable of efficient service on current and recent models. The 18-month Dallas program certifies graduates specifically for Rolex after-sales service on oyster movements, modern Rolex movements, not vintage calibers requiring specialized knowledge or part fabrication skills. The 35-year policy isn't new. It's been an official policy for years, but enforcement has become stricter as more watches age past that threshold and as Rolex consolidates its service network priorities. Collectors who bought Submariners in the 80s are discovering in the 20s that their investment pieces can't be serviced through official channels. Independent watchmakers compensate, but they operate in an environment where Rolex restricts parts access, limits who can receive training, and competes directly through the certified pre-owned program. Every independent repair is a service Rolex didn't control and didn't profit from. This creates several concrete outcomes worth understanding. For vintage watch owners, you inherit your grandfather's 1972 Submariner. Beautiful conditions, runs perfectly. You want to service it as a responsible owner should. Your options: find one of maybe 50 to 75 independent watchmakers nationwide with the skills, reputation, and parts access to do it properly. Service will cost $1,500 to $3,500 depending on what's needed. If significant parts need sourcing or fabricating, you could hit $4,000 to $5,000. Your watch might be worth $8,000 to $10,000, so you're spending half its value on maintenance, but you do it because it's family history. 5 years later, it needs service again. That same watchmaker is now overwhelmed with work. Backlog is 6 months. When you finally get it serviced, the cost is now $2,500 to $4,000 because parts have gotten scarcer and more expensive. You're looking at potentially $8,000 to $10,000 in service costs over a decade for a watch worth perhaps $12,000 to $15,000. At what point does maintenance become economically irrational? At what point do people just stop servicing vintage pieces and let them sit in drawers? The situation is the same if you are not a vintage watch owner. If you take your watch to an authorized service center, they estimate 4 to 6 months for a complete service because service centers are backlogged. Demand exceeds capacity. The watchmakers they have are focused on efficiency, getting through volume, not necessarily speed for individual pieces. You could go independent, but most independents won't touch modern Rolexes still under warranty or support. They don't want to risk voiding anything or creating issues with Rolex if something goes wrong. So you wait. 6 months later, you get your watch back. It runs beautifully. But you notice the bracelet looks different. They replaced some links. The crystal is new, the bezel is new. It's functionally perfect, but somehow doesn't look quite like your watch anymore. You didn't ask for all those replacements, but Rolex service protocol says anything showing wear gets swapped. And you'll pay the big bucks for the service plus parts. Next service in 5 to 10 years? Same process. Same weight. Same replacements. By the time the watch is 30 years old, how much of it is still original? If you are an independent watchmaker, the situation is still messy. You spent years building skills. Maybe you attended one of the traditional schools. Learned micromechanics, part fabrication, traditional restoration techniques. You're competent to service basically any mechanical watch. You want to specialize in Rolex because that's where demand is. But you can't get parts unless you're one of the 50 authorized independents. You can't get formal training from Rolex because they only train for their own service network. You can't advertise yourself as Rolex certified because you're not. You have to source parts from gray markets, donor watches, or fabricate them yourself, which requires tools most watchmakers don't have. You make it work. Build reputation through word of mouth. Develop relationships with parts suppliers. Invest in increasingly expensive tools. Your backlog grows to 6 months, then 8, then 12. You're turning away work because you physically can't handle more. But you also can't scale easily because training someone else with your skill set takes years, and the formal training programs no longer teach those skills. You're successful but operating in an ecosystem designed to eventually make what you do unnecessary. So, what next? The uncomfortable reality. In April 2025, Business Insider published a story that went viral in watch communities. A woman inherited her mother's vintage Rolex, beautiful piece from the 70s. Sentimental value beyond calculation. She took it to an authorized service center, expecting professional restoration. After all, this is Rolex, the brand that promises watches will last forever. They declined to service it. Parts unavailable. Watch too old. Policy is policy. The woman ended up finding Greg Petronzi through word of mouth. He could service it, but at costs and timelines the family hadn't anticipated. The story resonated because it revealed something most buyers don't discover until it's too late. Owning a Rolex and being able to maintain it long-term are two different things. Petronzi notes the psychological irony with the perspective of someone who studies human behavior professionally. People want stuff they can't have. When Rolex says, "Oh, forget this watch, we're not even going to service it," there's a part of our psyche that says, "You know what? That just makes me want this more." Scarcity creates desire. Exclusivity creates value. Limited access creates premium pricing. Rolex understands this better than almost any luxury brand. But desire doesn't solve the practical problem sitting in your desk drawer. What do you actually own when you buy a Rolex? You own the watch, obviously. The physical object, the metal, the movement, the craftsmanship. But you don't own guaranteed access to service after 35 years. You don't own the ability to source parts if they're discontinued. You don't own the expertise required to maintain it long-term if specialists become scarcer. Those remain under Rolex's control through certification requirements, parts restrictions, and service policies. For 35 years after discontinuation, you're covered, assuming parts remain available and service centers accept the work. After that, you're dependent on a shrinking pool of independents operating in an increasingly constrained environment. Think about what luxury ownership has historically meant. You bought quality that lasted. You bought craftsmanship that could be maintained. You bought into a system of support that ensured your purchase retained functionality and value over decades. That's why people pay $20,000 for a steel watch with a production cost estimated around $2,000 to $3,000. You're buying the ecosystem of support, not just the object. But the ecosystem is changing. It's becoming more controlled, more exclusive, and more selective about what it supports. Not through dramatic announcements or policy reversals that would generate bad press. Through quiet adjustments to training programs, parts availability, service protocols, and allocation systems. Walk into an authorized dealer today and you'll see empty cases. Not because watches don't exist, but because watches are held for customers who've proven themselves through purchase history. Ask about service for your father's 80s GMT Master, and you might get a polite decline. Not because it's impossible to fix, but because fixing it to Rolex standards might destroy what makes it valuable to you. Try to find a watchmaker who can fabricate a replacement part when originals aren't available. You'll discover there are maybe 2 to 3 dozen in America with those skills, and they're aging out while new training programs don't replace them. This isn't about hype. It isn't about waiting lists in the traditional sense. It isn't about artificial scarcity as typically understood. It's about Rolex redefining what ownership means in an ecosystem where the brand controls every access point: purchase, service, parts, training, and now significant portions of the secondary market. You can spend $20,000 on a watch. You can pass it to your kids with every intention of it lasting generations. But whether they can actually service it 40 years later depends on factors outside your control, determined by policies you didn't know existed when you bought it, enforced through systems designed to consolidate rather than distribute access. So what do you think about everything? Like this video and subscribe so you don't miss future investigations into what luxury brands aren't telling buyers. Drop a comment. Are you dealing with service issues on a vintage watch? Have you experienced the allocation system? The community wants to hear real stories.